Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we are talking about a paper that came out pretty recently, I think December of 2018. The paper is titled The Inherent Instability of Disordered Systems, and the authors are Taeer Bar-Yam, Owen Lynch, and Yaneer Bar-Yam. This is an interesting paper. It's got it's also a bit of an experiment for the show, I suppose, in having something that's like pretty damn short and kind of only really contains one idea that we'd like to talk about.
Right.
And contains a lot of maths that we're not going to talk about.
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. This one is these people are kind of complex systems theory sort of people, and the paper contains a lot of math which we're not going to cover because we don't really know any math, and so I think I have enough of a grip on the math to I followed along with the proof, but I don't think I can really describe it. Any math heads out there listening to this, maybe check it out and tell us if we're completely wrong in our interpretation of this.
There's a fair bit of written description to accompany the formulas. So for someone like myself who my mathematics education outside of high school is all self-taught. And pretty rudimentary in terms of things like calculus or linear algebra or advanced stats. All that stuff is pretty foreign to me. So I was not able to follow along with the argument, but I was able to at least understand what was written there in plain English.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? It's a very readable paper, like the plain English parts of it. So and it's only a couple of pages, so check it out. But so the sort of a general idea here is about systems and their organization, and particularly organization at scales, right? Like that organization at low scale, organization at high scale, this sort of thing. And I suppose the core of the argument is that systems which lack organization at a given scale are vulnerable to being kind of messed with or knocked over or simply taking on structure that emerges at scales higher than that.
They will be reorganized.
Yeah, right. which in the context of the paper counts as, I suppose in the context of system science counts as failure and collapse. That if a system fails to maintain its identity through time, it kind of counts as having failed, or it counts as a collapse of some kind.
Right. It's that idea of homeostasis that we've discussed before.
Yeah. So I suppose we get into it. They start out with the multi-scale law of requisite variety, which is an extension of Ashby's law of requisite variety that we've come across a couple of times before on the show, right, in the cybernetic brain, and when we were talking about Stafford Beer in his book, what was it, Designing Freedom, that would have been the last episode. Yeah, I really should remember that more quicker. So Ashby's law is this thing that if two systems couple to each other, say for instance if one of them is trying to regulate the other, that coupling can only really be successful if they have approximately the same variety, where variety is the number of states in a system, which is a kind of a proxy for its complexity. And the way they put it actually here a little bit further into the paper is that, given a system in an environment where the environment can be in each of V possible states, that each requires a distinct response by the system in order for it to succeed, in quotes, the system tautologically needs V responses available to it to guarantee success. So what we're emphasizing here is that a system is responding to its environment, and if it fails to respond, then it's kind of screwed, right? That if there are changes arising in the environment that overwhelm the system, then it's lights out for that system.
This is the thing that Stafford Beer was explaining with the department store example in Designing Freedom, right? That there are numerous different ways that a system can provide responses to its environment, but it is necessary for those responses to be made for the system to be viable. So it could be, having one service staff member for every customer in a department store, or it could be organizing customers into departments of interest and providing responses that way. But either way, the response has to be made, or you have a kind of chaos and breakdown of the system.
Yeah. And this idea is then extended with the notion of scale, right? Like things, scales bigger and smaller than each other, and so on. And that, like, the system needs to be able to respond to signals and stimulus at a given scale, right? So, like, for a system to really survive its environment, it has to be able to respond to, like, if there's a disturbance at a small scale, it has to be able to respond to that at that scale. If there's a disturbance at a large scale, it needs to be able to respond to that at that scale, right? And if this is all feeling a bit sort of abstract, we can sort of nail it down, right? That, like, one of the big problems with labor organizing at the moment is that the proletariat and the labor force is generally not organized above the scale of the individual. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here, right? That, like, a labor culture with strong unions and institutions is organized at many scales. It's organized at the scale of the individual worker, and at the scale of the shop, and at the scale of the union. And therefore, the union is able to tackle problems that arise from the environment at that scale, right? Such as industrial disputes, right? If we're not organized at that scale, which is basically the current sort of way we are now, then we're not able to respond to those disturbances at that scale.
Yeah, as a class,
yes,
right? We end up responding to our environment at an individual or possibly a family unit level, and that, because of the scale that we are acting at, that makes us conditioned by the larger scale organization of the capitalist system, right, of capital. It may sound a little bit incoherent to say that workers are not organized right now when you have something like, Uber or something like Amazon, organizing people at, city levels or world levels or all these things. There's enormous amounts of coordination systems that are happening in the world right now. It's just that we, as workers, are not able to respond to our environment at the level of our class interest. We can only respond at the level of our individual or family interest, because we don't have the organization necessary to maintain a class project, a class system.
Yeah. And in this paper, these guys are going to prove with math that being only organized at the individual level is completely bullshit, right? Like, it's not going to get you anywhere. To quote, then, we get quoting: "We find that due to its inability to respond, a completely unstructured system is inherently unstable to the formation of structure. And in general, any system without structure above a certain scale is unable to withstand structure arising above that scale." So the kind of implication here, and, like, I think one of the reasons I wanted to, like, talk about this paper is that they, later in the paper, they are explicitly kind of talking about the kind of anarchist, abstract vision of a kind of completely disorganized or unstructured society where it's all individual all the time. And the argument is that, like, well, kind of provably that can't work, because if you have this, like, or I suppose it's that kind of anarcho-Deleuzian sort of dream of a fully diffuse, disorganized society, like a disorganized body, in the sort of Deleuzian terms.
Yeah, the body without organs.
Even if that was achieved, it would immediately take on structure from its environment, right? And a kind of an obvious one for that, to kind of bring it back to concrete terms, would be it would take on geographic and structure. That, like, a diffuse, disorganized society, one that's all individual all the time, would immediately be structured along geographic lines or along the lines of weather patterns and so on. You see what that's what we kind of mean about, like, structure from the environment imposing itself essentially on a disordered system.
Which is just, pretty basic materialist observation, right? Is that
try telling the anarchists that,
Yeah.
I've been arguing with these folks for ages.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, to some extent, the argument here is a straw man of anarchism, right?
Yes.
Because, I feel like it really most strongly is attacking that kind of individualist libertarianism that is just complete nonsense, right? Where it's like, every person is an island, right? And, anarchists generally, advocate for forms of organization, right? It is, so that is I think the thing where they're talking about completely disorganized systems, that is certainly a critique that is viable against Deleuze, but may kind of miss the mark when it comes to anarchists. The point about scale is, I think, far more interesting. That actually does have something to say about various socialist strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the notion of scale is very important here. Moving on a tiny bit, they're sort of talking about how they're going to explore the dynamics of these disordered systems and take this kind of novel approach of studying the implications of failure, right? That what exactly is it that happens when a system succeeds or fails? And to quote, "Our objective is to characterize how the structure of a system changes spontaneously or as it in fact interacts with an environment. We find that in the context of an ordered environment, order arises in previously disordered systems."
Now, there is an important sort of philosophical point to make here, which is that the notion of success or viability in this definition is really quite antithetical to the assumptions that Deleuze makes, right?
Yeah.
That this idea of sort of continuity and structure being a mark of what is desirable is really very contrary to the assumptions that are at the base of sort of Deleuze's philosophical project. And so, I mean, that is something to keep in mind. However, I nevertheless enjoy it when I get up in the morning that my lungs are functioning in a regular pattern.
Yeah.
And that, my eyes are able to focus and unfocus as necessary, and my pupils can dilate, and my heart beats, which are all examples of systems that exist in a kind of homeostatic order and are responding viably to their environment.
Yeah. I think we probably need to schedule some time to talk about process philosophy at some point. I think we mentioned that a couple of episodes ago that we would try to get around to that, because I think I like that stuff quite a bit, and I think there's a lot to be said for emphasizing becoming over static being and so on. I think the authors of this paper are kind of taking a very simplifying assumption of continual identity being a fairly static property of the system, whereas Deleuze and the other sort of process philosophy people would be more well, it's a bit of both, right? It's kind of becoming, but then the becoming has stable identities for a while and then it slips and changes and stuff. I think my thing with Deleuze, I quite like a lot of his thought, but it's I think the diagnosis is quite good, but then the prescription is nuts.
Right.
The sort of the description of what it is to become and these sorts of I think his suspicion of identity and all that sort of stuff is kind of nice, but then with the way he then comes out with what we should really do is completely dissolve into completely abstract forms of becoming. It's nah, come on.
I think
that's kind of silly.
This is So it's nevertheless useful to sort of keep that perspective, that Deleuzenian perspective or the Deleuzenian critique in mind when reading a paper like this, because there is a sort of inherent tendency in systems thinking towards reification and that sort of like valorization of homeostasis and stasis in general, right? Like that isn't, certainly that was not the core of like Stafford Beer's thought. He had a lot of influences from process philosophy and various other things, but it's kind of like whenever you are working with the ideas of systems theory, there is a tendency in that direction, and so putting these things in dialogue is constructive, I think.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think like what they're doing here is they're doing that sort of systems theory thing, but they're also making a simplifying assumption for the sake of the argument. But to kind of touch back on your point previously, that stable continuous identity is something of an illusion, but it's kind of a useful illusion when it's your lungs or your eyes that have a stable identity through time, or an approximation of a stable identity. It's kind of like the illusion isn't so bad then.
Yes.
But
yeah, I mean, when we talk about viability, it is about continuous response to the environment.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, viability is not something that's actually discussed in this paper, right? But if we do bring in that idea from Beer, it is quite possible to look at that as a process of becoming, right?
Oh, yeah,
but it is. It's not that my eyes are actually a static entity. It's just that the process of change and becoming happens in such a way that they have a regular pattern to them, and that's kind of what it means to have that, homeostasis over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of other sort of foundational assumptions they're making in the paper, they take this assumption that if what is the way they put it? I'll quote here. Where internal self-organizing structures occur, we treat them as part of the external environment. Right, so that it's kind of like, I think the metaphor here is like something like a tumor, right? That like if a system develops an internal ultra-stable structure, that structure should be treated as if it were outside the system, even though it might be spatially enveloped inside the original system. And so that would go in biological systems, that would be like a tumor, but also in sort of just in general for like social systems, any set of agents that are not playing by the rules of the society would be treated as if they are part of the environment rather than being part of the original system. That's the other simplifying assumption here.
I mean, yes, that is true, but it also comes from this idea of perfect disorder that they are working with, right? That the simplifying assumption they have is that this anarchic system is a perfectly disorderly system. So any, if somebody raised the objection, well, what about internal self-organizing? What if that happened? Well, we're going to treat that as external because what we're concerned with is a perfectly disordered system. So any amount of order is already outside the bounds of that definition. Mm-hmm. So it's part of this simplification they're doing.
It's one of it puts you in this realm of needing to consider does all this still hold without the assumptions? I have a feeling it does. I sort of buy the argument in general. However, and I think they actually allude to it specifically that to do out the proof without those assumptions would be doable, but it would take a lot more paper, right? That it would be a much more arduous read if they were to not have those simplifying assumptions.
Yes.
Which, but I mean, keep the skeptical bit open here as well, right? That there are simplifying assumptions being made.
Yeah, they're using the simplest and most extreme case imaginable, right? That it's a perfect disorder, versus any amount of order.
But anyway, so getting back into it with the, they sort of start to like go through like they're building up their case here, right? That like again, touching on Ashby's law at multiple scales, that like the system has to be able to it responds to environmental behavior that occurs at various scales. So they use the letter K to stand in for a certain scale. So if a change or a disturbance arises at a scale K, then the system needs to be. The way they put it is that the system needs to have subsystems which have requisite variety at that scale to absorb the disturbance. They come up with an interesting but not incredible example of like a construction firm, where if you're a construction company, there's a kind of a trade-off between coordination and flexibility. Or to put that in more general terms, in general, there's always a trade-off between coordination and flexibility, right? That if you have many parts which are coordinated, they're able to handle large-scale responses. However, having lots of individual independent parts means you can handle varied responses. And that's just a general systems thing, right? To nail it down to more concrete terms, if you had this construction company which had 5 people and each person could learn 10 construction techniques, if you were to do the micro-scale thing, you could end up with 50 different ways of building a hut. Or if you were to do the macro scale thing, you could end up with 10 ways of building a very large structure. And the implication here is that, like, if, quote, disturbances coming from the environment are things like demands on the company or demands on this particular labor force to perform a particular kind of labor. So that if you're in the first scenario and you've got 50 different ways of building a shack, and somebody comes along and asks you to build a huge bridge or something, you're kind of screwed. Whereas in the opposite scenario, if you've got the 10 ways of building a bridge, then anyone who comes to you asking for a shack is kind of out of luck. So that's just to illustrate the trade-off between the kinds of organization you can have at different scales.
Yeah, and it shows the necessity of having subsystems, right? That because you do need that variety at lower scales, right? It's very much that thing of like you could build a huge bureaucracy that is very efficiently able to construct 5 things, but people need more than 5 things to survive in this world. And so you need to have subsystems that have more flexibility and less coordination.
Yeah. And I mean, when I was reading this, all through this paper, the sort of thing that kept jumping out at me was Stafford Beer's like viable system model, and particularly its recursive nature, where each, like in a viable system you have systems 1 through 5, but then each of the system 1 components is itself an entire viable system nested inside of it, and that's how in Beer's model you have like requisite variety at different scales. That to go back to the kind of metaphor of the body that he uses so much, that the liver is able to just absorb variety locally for itself, and it doesn't need to propagate to the other sort of parts of the body. They use one other sort of example. It's again that they're leaning on this example of like total disorder, of like a gas in a box, right, where like the gas molecules are only ordered at like the very smallest scale, which is to say that they're not actually ordered at all. It has no ordering above that scale, but the box has structure, and so it's in that interacting system, it's the box that determines the outcome, because the gas has nothing that it can do to resist it, which is a weird way of putting it, right? But like that's kind of what we're getting at there.
Yeah, this is I think coming from the gas law, and it is something we might talk about in the future, because it's also a point that Anwar Sheikh relies on very heavily in his thinking in capitalism. His gigantic statement on all economics that has ever been.
Yeah.
He uses this gas law idea to refute certain assumptions of neoclassical economics.
Yeah. Another sort of like point they touch on a little bit later as they sort of get into the math is that central control limits the flexibility at smaller scales, right? Which is a point that Stafford Beer brought up as well, that like central bureaucracies limit the ability of systems to respond at small scales. In exchange for perhaps an ability to respond at higher scales.
You kind of, I think with the sort of VSM ideas in mind, you may end up reducing the degree of overall coordination in exchange for greater flexibility, right? Like that may be the global trade-off that you make.
But yeah, this and they're kind of constantly coming back to like restating this sort of thing that disordered systems are unfit to respond to any variation in the environment at a scale larger than the individual parts. I think they even use the example of like I can't remember. Like I'm just looking at the notes, but like an example that pops to mind is like a drought in an anarcho-egoist gift economy, or even just like we don't even have to go for an imaginary example there. Climate change or just the ecological crisis in general is a fucking enormous scale problem, but that's actually part of the reporting on this problem, right? It's a constant refrain that we don't have structure at a scale sufficient to meet it. Right, like we don't have requisite variety at the scale of the world ecosystem. We don't have requisite variety at any of the necessary scales, right? Because the systems that we have organized in order to address the problem, such as carbon markets, at a large macro scale, are fundamentally flawed and inadequate, and we also do not have the flexibility necessary to address important questions like the fact that not all carbon is equal. Right? Like the context of carbon use is very important. And when you implement a system like a carbon market, it is completely ignorant of that context. So we have bad control. Like we have control to some degree, not a lot, but some degree at the global level, which is designed poorly. And then we don't have flexibility at the micro scale either. It's like the system is just purely degenerate. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't sort of work, right? Like, and that's kind of what they start to touch on then with the quote is that like structural change is the breakdown of expected behavior, right? That like you have a system that has expected behavior, and then because it can't meet the challenge at high scales, or I suppose not even always at high scales, like that a highly organized system, a highly centralized sort of system, to go back to the sort of example just a little bit before, right? That like something that is very, very organized at a high scale, but is doesn't have requisite variety at small scales, like it doesn't have individual flexibility, would be unable to respond to small scale problems.
It's very much those like that sort of like 2-chapter arc in Red Plenty goes on, like that goes to show like why the Gosplan system was totally ignorant of local variety, and then B, how requisite variety was achieved through incredibly perverse means, right? Right. So yeah, it's a good example of a system that is like just not sensitive or able to respond to its environment in the way it is designed.
Yeah, and I mean, as it's been, I think that there's a lot of touch points all through the material we've covered for the show, right? For this sort of stuff. Another is the dispossessed, right? That like the society on Anares was quite organized, but you could see that with the kind of like emergence of that weird cabal that was forming between the like science administrators and the shipping syndicate and the off-world people, that there was order emerging at a scale larger than the society in general could deal with, and that there was a sense that if that was going to continue, then that would eventually just dominate the society. I think another example the authors here lean on is how like long distance trade and markets come to eventually structure a society. Because like the trade networks and so on, and the markets exist at a scale that is larger than the kind of, you know, highest organization in the land, and so it kind of which gets us in the direction of that kind of Landian accelerationist thing of like thinking of markets and capital as a sort of alien intelligence or something, because if it is a high scale phenomena that's starting to impose its order on the comparatively less ordered society, it's easy to see how you would come away with that impression, right?
Yeah.
Or even like to go just even more examples from our run, like the stuff in All Watched Over, right, where you get the feeling from Curtis that he's talking about these kind of mysterious higher order processes that are going on above people's heads, and that the individual players aren't able to get a handle on.
Yeah, and I mean, this is explicitly something that Beer was addressing in Designing Freedom, right? Like, that is where his argument starts, is that the scale of organization that we deal with in our world today is very different than what used to exist. And we need to respond to that intelligently, or we're in big trouble. That is like the most basic, like, fundamental argument that Stafford Beer is making in that lecture series. Yeah, and I mean, you know, if you're talking about the market and stuff, like, as we've discussed, you can find that kind of idea in Marx as well, right? Like, it does go back to Marx in talking about, like, in Capital, or in even the Communist Manifesto, talking about, yeah, these systems that are acting upon the world as a kind of alien thing. So it's like, you know, Nick Land took up those ideas, but they're not inherently Landian.
No, sure, certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's very unfortunate that Land manages to dominate our thoughts in general. Like, not just our thoughts as in you and I, but like everyone's thoughts. Because like you even get the thing of like people dismissing Deleuze and a lot of the other process philosopher stuff because it's tainted by contact with Land. It's like, why are we so obsessed with this guy? You know, he sort of takes ownership over whatever he fucking touches. Got to take it back from him, you know?
I agree.
But so like this stuff is. Like, I mean, this paper isn't explicitly like a cybernetics thing, but it's systems theory, which is sort of adjacent to cybernetics. I mean, they're using Ashby's law, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's complexity theory, which I feel like is really a descendant of cybernetics.
Yeah, it's like a watered down cybernetics. But it's cybernetic. Like, I think to touch back on what we were talking about earlier, like it's cybernetics, but shorn of that process ontology weirdness that we read about in the cybernetic brain. But I think that the value here is that, yeah, I mean, like a lot of this stuff that like we have here a formalism for thinking about this problem that goes beyond any, like, as I said, like these sort of notions do come up all over the place, but like I think that it's nice to have a tool here that, or just have it proven, like on paper, that look, this isn't a problem because of some kind of you know, historical ghost that's fucking with us, or like you know, Land's version of it where it's like a Terminator from the future is like reaching back through time. No, it's just a fact of math, right? Like if you understand how systems work, this is just how these things work. And what's great about that, and what's great about cybernetics in general, is it makes this stuff tractable, right? That like we can, as socialists and as people who have, you know, some pretension to wanting to like take over the world, I suppose, or to like organize society, or to organize the management and the you know, operations of society, and to help society to organize its own operations, all that sort of stuff. It's kind of nice to have these formalisms so that we're not just left floundering, like wondering like, oh, why are these things so complex and why are they so horrible? Yeah, it's kind of nice.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's useful when you look at like you know, a case like the failures of Syriza. You can say like you can provide some kind of alternative narrative to the betrayal narrative, right? That you know, they were capitalist rotors all along, or this kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, it's always possible for people to have bad intentions or to be selfish, but you can provide a more sophisticated analysis if you have an understanding of this kind of multi-scalar problem.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm kind of aware here that we're skipping over like big chunks of this as well, because like a lot of it is kind of repeating more or less the same point in a couple of different ways, and kind of putting out a mathematical formalism for it. Yeah, is there anything else we need to talk about there before we get to the math bit, which we probably won't talk about very much before going on to the conclusions? So, I mean, like, section 2 then is like doing the information theoretic formalism for structural change, which I guess is what they're talking about in that previous bit, right? The change in the system. And it's pretty long and kind of mathy, and I sort of followed a lot of the math, but the conclusion is that they're proving that the system is vulnerable to structure arising above a given scale. That's just what it's about.
Yeah. Which is really the interesting point here.
Yeah. That it's vulnerability, right? That like yeah, I just think that like I think maybe one thing to sort of emphasize as well that we didn't quite get around to about the scale thing is that back in the Xenofeminist Manifesto episode, I think we got to talk a little bit about like this notion of like the mesopolitical, which is proposed as being a sort of middle ground between the micro-political and the macro-political. And I think what we're doing here with scale is we're generalizing that further. Like, you start out by saying that there's two scales, there's micro and macro. And that's kind of a dead end. We're all familiar with all the shitty sort of thinking that comes out of that. We get this tentative proposal, hey, maybe there's a third level in between them, you know, three scales. But then the natural sort of conclusion for that thought is to say, well, there's n scales, like the integers, right? There's, you know, as many of them as you want. And that I think what's, you know, kind of important here is that like so Kyle, in the green room you had a point about like emergence at given scales.
Right, yeah, which is to say that, well, yeah, I mean, there's this idea that, you know, like, yeah, we could have n scales up to any number of levels, or down to any number of levels, but it is important to keep in mind the possibility of emergent phenomena that make the scales like meaningfully discrete from each other, right? So, which is I think at least what the idea of macro systems is trying to capture, right? That there are behaviors that don't exist at the micro scale and are not directly derived from anything at the micro scale, but are emergent of micro activity and are only evident at a higher scale, right? Which people usually call the macro scale. But that is, as you said, a very fuzzy term, right? And I feel like really what they're trying to capture is thinking about emergent phenomena at a larger scale than the individual or like a small community.
Yeah. It's kind of unfortunate that emergence doesn't get mentioned specifically in this paper, but it's very much present in cybernetics and in sort of like Stafford Beer's thinking, and I think I was reading this paper in those terms, right? Like, so I think the connection works on a very natural level for me, but it's not actually explicitly in the paper, right? I think that this would be very very useful to combine with I think it makes more sense when you sort of look at it through like an assemblage kind of lens, where or in the sort of viable system model, where you have this recursion where higher scale components are composed out of lower scale components, and that each scale has its own novelty that emerges. But the distinction is that like there isn't exactly two scales called micro and macro, that they're relative. So that at a given scale, there'll be a smaller scale which you would consider micro, and there'll be a bigger scale which you would consider macro. But that's also true if you step up to the next macro level and you get that emergent behavior. And then there's another scale above it that has more emergent behavior.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy enough to think about, like, in the sense that, for example, we talk a lot about capitalism on this show. But the functioning of the capitalist system is strongly conditioned by the dynamics of our solar system, which is a macro scale phenomenon that we usually don't talk about in economics, right?
Or even just if you think of the recursive components of capitalism, because I think it's this is perhaps why, like, we've talked a lot about on the show about like or I mean, maybe not in general on the show, but like in the transforming technology episodes, we had the problems of like Marcuse and Foucault, right, where they saw this immense edifice that was just called the system, like capitalism or whatever, and it was impenetrable and you could never really argue with it and all that kind of horrible stuff. But that it's more fruitful to look at it as a recursively composed assemblage, right? That like it is like you start out with individual humans and then you combine humans with like machines and infrastructure to create a shop floor, and then you combine shop floors to make a company, you combine companies to make a firm, you combine firms to make an industry, you combine industries to make a sector, you combine sectors to make a market, all this kind of stuff, right? That like it's more fruitful to see it in that scaled way than it is to just say there's the individual down here and then there's the big horrible thing up here. You know, that's a very kind of narrow and undetailed way of looking at it. But like when you see the recursive detail of how these things are assembled, you get much. There's more play in the assemblage of the things, and there's more room for emergent behavior at each scale. Because like the emergent behavior in a factory, in a shop floor, is going to be different in kind than the emergent behavior at an industry level, and the same again at a market level or whatever.
Yes, yeah, which is maybe why, that is why this mesopolitical idea was invented, certainly. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind that there is a specificity to scales that doesn't fall into a three stage categorization of micro, meso, and macro in any kind of neat way. It's, I guess, like it is very much a matter of constructing a conceptual model that has the requisite variety to think about our world, right? And organization into categories, as we saw in like Stafford Beer's example of the department store, is a way to deal with that variety. And so having, macro, meso, micro may be useful, but then you lose a lot of flexibility in that categorization, right? So there's definitely questions of sort of conceptual organization there that are important, and as you say, we tend to often default to thinking that the macro scale is sort of determinate and impenetrable, and just like the capitalist system as a whole is just unmovable. And it is that very sort of Landian way of thinking, and isn't actually going to get us anywhere.
No.
To think so.
Do you think more fundamentally, though, it's like kind of it's sort of neoliberal thinking or whatever, or like late capitalist thinking, that in so many ways, like I think when we fall into this kind of despairing mode of thinking of like, oh well, how are we ever going to beat this colossal dragon? You know, like it's we're falling for the ideology there, like the ideology of like, oh well, you see, there's you as an atomized individual, and then there's this huge fucking thing, and you have no hope of ever matching it. That we're buying into that sort of thing. And this stuff, right, this cybernetic stuff and this Bar-Yam stuff and some of the stuff in this paper gives us a little bit of a way out, right, where we can actually conceptualize what organization really means and what structure really means at various scales. What kind of organizations will we require? You know, requisite variety and such. What will we require to tackle the problems we're facing, such as the ecological problems, right, or the problems of capital and such? You know?
Yeah, and I would hope that it would also allow us to see where the macro systems are vulnerable to change, right? Because that is something that we very desperately need to understand. Yeah.
I think they sort of mention it like when they're talking about the like social unrest as a sort of new system budding off from the old system, but they're like, yeah, it's about the sort of lever points and vulnerabilities of the old system and so on. But like getting towards the end, there's this sort of bit, I'm quoting here, that the framework of this paper does not allow us to identify what is a viable replacement for central control. However, developing a theory of which systems are stable and which are not stable is an important step towards answering this question. Which brings us back to our boy beer, right? Like, I mean, they use the word viable. It's right there.
Because I think the reason why this doesn't work as an example that allows them to think about replacements for central control is because they just have this very simple example, right? That it is disorganization versus any degree of organization, and then the matter of greater scales of organization. It's just so abstract, right? But what they're hoping to talk about is giving a little bit more nuance to the system's understanding of homeostasis, right? Because what they were saying in the beginning of the paper was basically that other papers had talked about the conditions for system failure, but had not talked about the consequences of system failure. And so they're trying to develop a kind of conceptual vocabulary here to be able to think abstractly about systems at different scales and how they might be organized. And hopefully this is like a starting point for being able to think about different modes of organization. Because, yeah, I mean, if you have a system of any degree of organization operating in a disorganized system, then of course you're going to end up with central control, right? Because there's one pole here that is organized and the other one is not, and so you're going to end up with central control. But hopefully there are more complex examples, more nuanced examples, more interesting examples that they will be able to continue to work on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's that problem of like math papers in general where they give you the trivial example because it's the shortest thing to write on the paper, but you're left to churn through other examples in your mind, you know. And like for us, like we're kind of relatively well versed. Well, I wouldn't say well versed in cybernetics, but like we're probably better versed than most people are in it, like given it's such a niche sort of thing. But like it's pretty easy for us to read this paper and go, oh yeah, I could kind of see how that would work with, you know, some arbitrarily organized thing interacting with this other arbitrarily organized thing. But like it's kind of exercise for the reader, rather than being something that's explained fully. So
yeah, it's part of a academic and intellectual project that they're engaged in too, right? Like this is the groundwork they're doing for something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, then I think that's pretty much all we need to talk about for the sort of content of the paper. But the authors trail off on something I'll quote here. However, rather than relying on analogies to physical systems, we have the ability to study society directly with information theoretic laws and draw more sophisticated conclusions. The multi-scale law of requisite variety implies that there is no single organizational silver bullet. Different organizational strategies are best suited to different environments. Our addition of a formalism from multiscale noise opens the door to characterizing the stability and dynamics of complex systems. A more general approach may help us discover how to change our society from the inside to better fit the complexity profile of modern challenges. So, yeah, I mean, kind of like the same thing we were talking about in Designing Freedom, really, you know? Very similar, but coming from a wildly different sort of context. This is much more of an academic sort of thing.
I think that they are saying here that they're managing to create a conceptual framework to talk meaningfully about multi-scale organization, right? What we previously had in Designing Freedom was more of an understanding of the need for different organizational strategies, and not so much like the mathematical formalism about different scales interacting with each other. This is kind of what we get here.
Yeah, we get I think the big takeaway is scale, right? That's the major sort of novelty, because it doesn't come up very much, like ever with anything. You know, we're stuck in this kind of micro macro divide that isn't very useful. So there's a bit of a kind of call to action here in figuring out like what to do with this sort of stuff, and I think we're kind of on the right track. Like we're starting to assemble the pieces, right? We've got the general sort of gist of like British cybernetics and its weird ontologies. We've got Stafford Beer's viable systems in general. We've added this notion of scale and like organization at various scales, and how systems need to be organized at, you know, scales appropriate to the challenges they're facing. We've also touched on, the kind of like process orientation and such, and I think this has been a pretty quick read, and it's been a shortish episode, but I think there's useful stuff in here.
Yeah, I think there's useful stuff here. It's been an interesting discussion. I feel like my personal understanding of the text is probably less than what it needs to be. Having had a month from reading it to this discussion has not really been great, and I definitely apologize to the listeners for not having a better grasp of the material, but I think it's nevertheless been thought-provoking and has allowed us to think about various different examples we've seen on the show and various different concepts that we've brought together here. So hopefully in the future we'll continue to sort of have this influence of more abstract cybernetic thinking, but also I will strive to be better informed about the nuances and particulars of what's being discussed.
Yeah, I mean, but like I don't particularly understand it either, but like didn't stop us from recording the show, right? Like,
yeah, right.
But I mean, this is as if the listeners couldn't tell, but this is an active research program for us, right? Like as well, like we're sort of learning this stuff as we go along. Also, I think this episode has been a bit of an experiment with the format as well, where we've taken something that's a lot shorter than what we usually read and given us a bit more wiggle room to go on digressions. So listeners, let us know if it worked or if it didn't, if you'd like to hear a bit less of this sort of thing. But I mean, they can't all be good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think an advantage here is that it will be quite easy for listeners to pick up the text. Right, it's free, it's easily accessible, it's short, and for those of you who have been asking us to sort of more directly engage with cybernetics, I guess this is a beginning to that. Right, we've had Beer's sort of very public lecture discussed on the show, but this is the first time that we've engaged in something that's extremely academic, related to cybernetics, and there will be probably more of it to come, and we'll sort of, as we go, figure out what the right approach and format is for that.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. But yeah, thanks listeners for sticking with us on this one. And I do hope it turned out well.
Yes.
If you want to catch us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit, and you can find us at generalintellectunit.net. We're also up on archive.org as well, if you're ever looking for a sort of permanent, semi-permanent archive of our stuff. If you just search for General Intellect Unit. And if you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and kick us a couple of bucks a month, which just helps us pay for books and hosting costs and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I guess that's it for this episode. And we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.